Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the crucial link between emotional intelligence, or EQ, and cultural intelligence, or CQ. Before we dive into our discussion today, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping or logistical items. This session today is going to be 1 hour long. And the first portion of the webinar covering rich discussion with our panelists, who I'm going to introduce here in just a moment. And then in the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar, we will be answering questions from our audience. So I'd like to ask everybody to take just a moment to look at the bottom of your screen where you're going to notice a chat or a Q&A functionality. During the webinar, I'll ask you to utilize this functionality to both send questions to the panelists that you'd like to be considered for answering at the end of the session, and also to ask any technical questions that you might have. I'll take just a moment to ask you to take note of Sherry, System Administrator, who's on the call with us today. Sherry's here to make sure that everything goes well from a technical standpoint, so please feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions. We have a lot to cover today, including the differences between emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence, how CQ allows us to pick up from where EQ leaves us, and how we can leverage both cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence for more effective, sustained organizations, institutions. Before I ask the first question, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, starting please with Viviane Vicente.
Hello, thanks, Keila. Good day, everyone. And I see that we have many time zones represented here. I am joining you today from Madrid, Spain. It's already mid-afternoon here. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Viviane Vicente. I'm a master facilitator with the Cultural Intelligence Center, which means that I deliver training sessions, certification programs, and I'm also part of the team developing new content and adapting content based on the cultural intelligence or CQ framework. Really happy to be here.
Thank you, Viviane. Ratika Wadwa, please.
Good afternoon from London, UK. I am Ratika and I am the Director of UK Operations. So doing everything from development to delivery. We are about a year old in the UK and really excited to be part of this webinar because there's a lot of discussion around the link between CQ and EQ, and looking forward to listening in to my other panelists and the questions coming in.
Great, thank you, Ratika. And we see we have our fourth panelist who I'm going to allow now to introduce himself. Quentin, please feel free.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So wonderful to be with you. My name is Quentin Pitorius, all the way from South Africa, and super excited to be with you. I normally introduce myself like this. I have one wife, one son, one daughter, 2 dogs, and I want no more of those beautiful things that fill my life with passion and purpose. And I'm super excited to be with everybody today.
Thank you, Quentin. Before I jump into the first question, I'll take just a moment to introduce myself. I'm here to moderate and facilitate our discussion today with these expert panelists. My name is Keila Wisłowski. I'm a Vice President of the Cultural Intelligence Center here in the US offices, working out of the Metro Detroit area. So welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get into our first question of the day, and that is, what is the connection between emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence? And I'm going to ask our master facilitator, Viviane, to go ahead and start us off with this one, please.
Of course, thank you, Keila. Perhaps we should start with some basic definitions. And cultural intelligence, or CQ, is the capability to function effectively when operating in a variety of cultural settings or in culturally diverse settings. And then emotional intelligence, if we are to simply define it, is the ability to detect and regulate our own emotions and to identify the emotions of others and respond accordingly. So, of course, emotional intelligence is something that we should all work on to develop, to maintain our mental health and to develop genuine and productive, strong relationships. Also, to lead in a respectful and inclusive manner. But emotional intelligence is culturally conditioned. It is culture bound. The way emotions are displayed varies across cultures. And what is accepted or expected by one cultural group may not be welcome or may be misinterpreted if we don't understand what is familiar to that group. So in a very simple way to illustrate this, a smile or a stoic face or even a raised eyebrow may have very different meanings depending on the location, the generation, even the gender that you are interacting with. The original researchers on cultural intelligence, they differentiated two basic types of intelligence to conduct their research: academic and non-academic intelligence. But prior to that, other researchers had identified three non-academic forms of intelligence: emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and practical intelligence, the ability to solve problems. And of course, all of those are important for one to be successful in life and at work. And we can all work to become intelligent in our own culture. We almost intuitively know how to do that. But when crossing cultures or when cultural diversity is involved, the ability to understand how people display emotions and how they perceive the emotions of others, how they act socially, and how they perceive problems, and the ability to flex our behavior will be essential. So that is CEQ.
Thank you, Viviani. Ritika, I'd like you to answer this one as well, but first I'm going to take a moment to answer one of the audience questions. Yes, this webinar will absolutely be recorded, and everyone who was able to attend today, and for anyone who wasn't, we will be sharing a link to this recording. So thanks for that question. Ritika, can you go ahead and pick up where Viviani left us?
Thanks, Keela. Gosh, how can you ever pick up from where Viviani left us? But I'll just try and endeavor to answer that with my limited knowledge of it, which is EQ has four aspects. When you assess yourself on EQ, it isn't that you're good or bad. There are four aspects of EQ that you assess yourself on. That is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. I say this because really cultural intelligence is built from the premise of self-awareness. It is a critical part of our emotional intelligence. So just that link, even from a research perspective between EQ and CQ, is so strong. CQ, the way I see it, is a journey of self-awareness. It starts with the CQ drive, the why you're on the table. You can't get on that journey of CQ without being aware of your biases, your privileges, the why behind it, which is also really the foundation of EQ. Now, I want to shake this up a little bit and throw it in because I love Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking. And just sort of prepping for this webinar and reading more and talking to the other panelists, I sort of feel there's a real link even in that, in how we respond intuitively, because it's an emotional response. And also how we then use our slow System 2 thinking, which to me gears further towards how CQ is essential in when we respond slowly. Quentin, what are your thoughts?
Throwing me on System 1, System 2 thinking, probably going to be answering you on system one thinking here, but I think often our emotions are very much system one thinking, right? Somebody cuts me off in the traffic, or I get into a fight with somebody at work, or my internet gets cut. And so immediately I jump to my emotions that will trigger a particular response. And it'll be what comes naturally to me in my cultural context. But if I don't have the CQ connection there, I might be able to, I will be making more mistakes than not if I'm not aware of myself in those moments, and knowing that my knee-jerk reaction might resonate with somebody on this call and might not resonate with somebody because of particular emotions. And I've seen that play out in so many different ways in our context here in South Africa, where one person's emotions are completely misunderstood from another, just because we lack this cultural understanding around who we are. And so that drive and knowledge, CQ knowledge, comes through really well. Ritika?
Yeah, that's great, Quentin. And actually, that's a perfect segue into another question that I'd like to have all three of our panelists answer. So we know, can you think about a time when either you yourselves, or having observed this, have been highly emotionally intelligent, but that wasn't translating culturally? You just started to touch on this, Quentin, and why don't you continue with that, and then we'll pass it along to Ritika.
I've got so many mistakes in this area, but the one that reminds me is early on in my early days of youth work. I was working in an African setting in a township in South Africa. I was probably 20, 21, and I did an amazing job of facilitating a session around HIV/AIDS. I was knocking the ball out the park, but there was this young woman in the front of the class that wasn't responding emotionally well with what it is. She was completely shut off to what I was doing, and I took exception to this. And in fact, I actually called her out on her non-responsiveness to this excellent job that I was doing. And now that I'm 20 years down the track in understanding cultural intelligence and understanding that we have different cultural value systems, she probably was completely hooked in. But because she wasn't expressive in the way she was engaging with me, I probably misunderstood that completely. And so had I had a little more cultural intelligence, knowing how different cultures show up, I've probably been a little bit more graceful in terms of how I would have handled that situation. So that's one example that comes to mind. I don't know if any of the other panelists have something that comes to mind immediately.
Can I just say, thanks for that, Quentin, but I want to go outside the work to a more personal example, only because here's the thing. I come from a culture that's vastly different from the culture I live in. So the emotions that I was taught growing up in a very collectivist country that I grew up in, India, to the countries that I have then subsequently lived in, which is Canada and the UK, more individualistic countries, even how we express ourselves can be very different. But let's put that to the side for a second. When I was dating my then boyfriend, who was Greek, he took me to Greece for the first time to meet his parents. Of course, after the introductions, which were very pleasant, I sat down with my cup of tea, glass of water, I can't remember, or might have been ouzo, I don't remember. They just went off on some sort of a discussion. My emotional intelligence kicked in. Their faces started becoming red. The pitch started becoming higher and higher. The hand expression started getting really animus. And I'm just sitting there thinking, oh my God, this hasn't gone well at all, has it? When can I get my next flight out? When that discussion died down, I obviously took him to the side and said, is everything okay? That was my panicked heart going, oh my God, I really want to marry this guy and it hasn't gone down well at all, has it? And he goes, why? What's the problem? I said, well, everyone was really upset. He goes, upset about what? I said, I don't know. Do they not like me? What? No, they were just discussing where to take you out for dinner. They were just trying, they like you enough to have a discussion animatedly about wanting to take you out to their favorite individual restaurants. That's all it was. So really, I mean, even in that personal situation, the whole premise of how CQ takes off from where EQ leaves you. Your EQ will take you to that far because of the way you were brought up in the culture and how you were conditioned to express emotions in a certain way. That conditioning is what moves on to the next level as an adult, where you read emotions in a certain way, but they do not always translate culturally. So that's my example.
I love that example, Ritika, and thank you for bringing a personal element to this, because it's true. Whether it's emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence, it shows up in many places, not just our professional or work lives. It shows up in our personal lives as well. Thank you for that story. Viviani,
sorry, Keela, can I just I am happily married to the Greek man. And when we are back in Greece and they have these animated discussions, it makes more sense. So just to sort of, moving on from that.
Yep, closing that loop. We're glad to hear that. Viviani, is there anything that you'd like to share? Any personal examples or anything you've observed where emotional intelligence didn't quite translate culturally?
Certainly. I'd like to also mention a personal example before I cite one study about that. So I remember a few years ago interacting with someone who became someone very close to me, but who had a different cultural background, both in terms of the country of origin, but also the generation. And I remember becoming quite annoyed when they were telling me a story or making an argument, and they would ask me several times during their talk, their speech, do you follow? And I remember becoming annoyed and quite offended. And in my mind, I would say, I'm reasonably intelligent. Yes, I follow what you're trying to say. But I failed to realize then that they were expecting me to be more expressive as I followed along their argument. They expected me to affirm what they were saying, or at least to adjust my facial expressions and show more enthusiasm. And in my cultural background, the way I was taught is to be more deferent and respect your others. And that respect in my head was about remaining silent while they were talking. Maybe at the end, offering my opinion and my reactions, but not interrupting them, not even to say, oh yes, I see. And I was just saying nothing, and I was just silently paying attention to them. And to them, that was, they were unsure if I was really listening and understanding what they were saying. So only with that cultural knowledge, so CQ knowledge, for those of you familiar with the CQ framework, I was able to then understand what was expected or acceptable in that cultural group, and then to adjust my behavior to show the respect that was my intent all along. So now back to a professional setting, I'd like to cite just one study that was conducted with European military officers who had both domestic and cross-border responsibilities. And this study was conducted using multiple sources, so a 360 sort of evaluation, and using multiple intelligences, so assessing multiple intelligences. And the results were that general intelligence, or IQ, predicted both domestic and cross-border leadership effectiveness. EQ, or emotional intelligence, was a stronger predictor of domestic leadership effectiveness. And CQ, or cultural intelligence, was a stronger predictor of cross-border effectiveness. Now, even if we are not crossing geographical borders, most of us are working within diverse, heterogeneous environments and multicultural teams most of us are interacting with. So that's why we need both, because our emotional intelligence may be high in our own context, but does that not necessarily translate into cultural intelligence? So the understanding and the ability to adjust our behavior to remain respectful, effective, inclusive.
Yeah, very, very well stated, Viviani. Thank you. I'm going to take a moment to address some of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat. Thank you to some of our audience for sharing some really helpful articles and resources amongst yourselves. We'll also be sure when we follow up with access to the recording from this webinar that we share with you some of the helpful resources and tools and articles that we've come across. Okay, anybody else want to take that question further? Or are we ready to step into our next one? Quentin, I see you came off mute.
Oh, no, I was just following. I was just being ready to go. Sorry.
Right.
I've got lots of examples, but I think let's move on for time's sake.
Great.
Can I just interject there, Keela? There's a lot of questions around the research element. So thanks to everyone, as you mentioned earlier, on the System 1, System 2 thinking. There's also a blog on the Cultural Intelligence Center website that we'll post that Dave's written on EQ and CQ. But equally, I'd like to refer to Paul Ekman's work around facial expression. So Paul Ekman, and he finds that people from all over the world express sadness, fear, anger, surprise, happiness using similar facial expressions, even when they're born blind, for example. So that's integral to how we express ourselves. And the examples that the rich examples that our panelists have given is around how you express. Me not understanding the language, all I was going with was the expression. So where that sort of leaves off is CQ. The cultural differences begin to come to play into play when the rules are sort of how do we appropriate manage these emotions based on how we were brought up, and we were conditioned in sort of manipulating our own emotions in how much and how far we express it. And that's where sort of CQ takes off. So I'll put that in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ritika. So those are really interesting stories and examples, a blend of personal and professional stories. Here's a new question, and one that I think is interesting. Should we consider skipping over EQ or emotional intelligence and going straight to CQ? Viviani, let's start with you on this one.
I would say we shouldn't, because as Ritika mentioned in the beginning, CQ, a big part of CQ is becoming self-aware. And the motivational dimension of CQ drive is really about developing that motivation. So you need to develop that motivation to derive enjoyment, derive joy from interacting with people who have different cultural backgrounds, to understand the benefits of doing so. So I may become a more effective leader. I may be better able to manage and motivate people on my team. I may be able to bring the best and be inclusive and ensure that everyone can contribute to the best of their ability, get to the best of their performance, if that I have this motivation, this CQ drive. And emotional intelligence is all about that. So also being aware of when I'm fatigued, when I am tired, when I am not motivated personally, and I'm not at my best, that is also part of CQ drive. So developing that persistence, that perseverance. How can you do that if you are not emotionally intelligent? If you haven't developed that motivation to understand your own emotions and to manage your own emotions. So I would say, yes, we all need to develop our emotional intelligence, and that will help us develop our cultural intelligence.
Great, Viviani, thanks. I know when we were preparing for this webinar, Quentin in his System 1, maybe I might be able to say that, said, of course, we can go straight to CQ, but I'll let him go ahead and answer himself on this question. What do you think, Quentin? Can we skip EQ and go straight to CQ?
I'd like to say yes, but I think as I'm thinking about it, we express ourselves so much, like everything about our culture. If I'm thinking in the South African context, we're such an expressive nation. And so our cultures are often expressed through our emotions. And if we don't understand that, we don't really have a platform then to move beyond that. So I think they're integral. It's like a hand and a glove. They work side by side. And I think you can't just say, I want to have cultural intelligence without understanding EQ. But I think often people stop at EQ and thinking that it's just universal, and that if I have EQ, I can go into any culture and just be okay with that. And I think that's where we need to be aware that we need to move beyond that, because I think it just helps us be far more effective when we're going into different cultures. So I was on this dance and drama team in 1999. We were doing these incredible dances here in South Africa, and people were dancing and clapping and doing it was amazing. We took the same dances to Germany, doing the same kind of stuff with the same age group. And this is how the Germans responded. And afterwards, I said, that was amazing. Thank you. And if I didn't have the cultural intelligence to understand that Germany is a neutral culture, I would never have appreciated what people were engaging with us. So I think that they have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, we make a lot of mistakes and become misunderstood as leaders and as people generally.
Great. Ritika, do you have something to add?
Sure. Thanks, Keela. Gosh, Quentin, you're right. Like, when you develop the EQ with the CQ, suddenly it starts making so much more sense. Equally, I just want to step back a little bit before I answer the question, Keela, around defining cultures. A lot of our viewers watching would definitely be aware, but just to reiterate, culture is a set of behaviors we identify with. So it isn't just nationality. The way I express myself as a woman could be very different to the way men express themselves, and vice versa, just to sort of give a top-end example of that. But going back to your question, Keela, it's EQ is, I feel, almost essential to be a successful leader. It's the first step really to becoming more culturally intelligent, because it makes you more self-aware. Going back to the premise of EQ and CQ, where the self-awareness journey is all that is at the start of it. I personally can't hope to read emotions in an unfamiliar culture if I can't even do it in my own.
Correct.
So if we just start off with that, understanding emotions, and by culture, again, I mean, I can't hope that if I can't translate a woman's emotions, and again, without stereotyping, I want to put that caveat there, without stereotyping, how can I ever even consider that translating other genders as an example? So EQ is essential to start off on that journey, but we keep saying that CQ is where it takes off. Both of them are essential in very different ways for the success of a leader in the global situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, thanks, Ritika, for making sure that we understand that culture can be defined very, very broadly, right? Viviani said this earlier. Not many of us are going through our days interacting with everybody who's just like us all the time, right? That's not true. We all need to be both emotionally and culturally intelligent. I have a bit of a different question I'd like to ask. So I wonder if there is a dark side to emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. And before I ask the panelists to give their thoughts on this, I'll speak for just a moment. I think it's possible for any framework or intelligence model to be manipulated depending on how it's balanced or how it's applied. For example, Ritika shared this earlier, in the cultural intelligence framework, one of the important elements or aspects of that is our drive, our motivation. And if we break that down and look at our own motivations and say to ourselves, for example, that we're very extrinsically motivated, could that lead us to overemphasize our external environments and how to manipulate certain situations to get what we're motivated to get externally? So I put it to the panelists. Is there a potential dark side to emotional and cultural intelligence, and how might we combat that? Quentin, how about we start with you?
I definitely think there are lots of examples of a dark side of both of these. And what comes to mind initially is politicians around the world, how politicians use emotional intelligence to manipulate constituencies to either root for them and vote for them, or to turn those constituencies against somebody else, right? And so once I understand what are trigger points for particular communities that I want to engage with, I can definitely use that to either get favor for the people that I'm engaging with, or to turn my people against that. I think religious institutions use emotional manipulation really well, and understanding what are those trigger points to motivate people to give money or to give support to something. And I think that I've seen that all too often in the South African context, at least, and my little bit of understanding of global context, that politicians, or maybe I should say people in power, use those quite effectively to manipulate people. And then if you don't understand it, it becomes really interesting how you can. So I was in a situation where I used an emotional pull on a group of people, and I got the group riled up, but I didn't know where to go beyond that. And I realized very quickly how we can use people's emotions very, very easily. I don't know if my panelists have any other dark side responses to this. Ritika.
Before I ask Ritika to jump in, I think one of our audience members had a very interesting comment. Thank you, Bill. He says, I would think that knowledge of EQ and CQ doesn't necessarily mean one is healthy in EQ and CQ. And I would agree with that, which is why we need to think about going beyond just an awareness. An awareness alone of emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence doesn't get us where we need to go unless we understand how to strategize or flex our behaviors appropriately, depending on who we're engaging with. Ritika, let's hear from you.
Love that, Keela. Love the audience participation. And everyone wants to know a little bit more about the dark side, of course. How far can we take our knowledge? I want to say something, and I'm going to pause to let that sink in. 90-second pause is the difference between a reaction and a response. And I'm pausing for that to sink in, because literally, again, I'm bringing system 1, system 2 thinking, because system 1 means something happens, something triggers, you respond. If you pause for 90 seconds, that means that you can regulate your emotions and how you respond better. Now, if that's all you do, how are you manipulating? That's my question back to the audience and the panelists. How are you manipulating? Are you manipulating? If you get better at doing this as a leader, how does that show into the dark side? It's that gap between how we understand people's emotions across cultures using very high EQ and then high CQ, the 4 aspects of both EQ and CQ. How do you show up as a leader? And if it is in manipulations, of course, how effective that is. But then if you take it to the other extreme, look at the people around you, the politicians, as Quentin referred to. Not all of them are our favorites. Look at what's going on in the US right now. How is that manipulation at the core of it? So I think without sort of getting into polarized discussion around this topic, I want to leave that with the audience and a little bit more engagement on that.
Ritika, that is such a challenging 90 seconds is like a lifetime for some of us expressive culture people, right? Like a lot can happen in those 90 seconds. I know I often ask my participants to be quiet for 30 seconds, so like 1 minute, and the expressive people become edgety and fidgety because that 60 seconds is a lifetime for some people. So I find that so challenging, and thanks for challenging us, even on a webinar where that 30 seconds of quietness, that pause that you gave, might make people feel like we've forgotten our words. You know, so I think that's such a powerful comment that you've made.
You know, like I think call it gray hairs or, you know, call it experience. What I've learned from that myself is really, even when I get an email, for example, that isn't something that I want to hear or know, I usually never respond without having slept on it. And my response is very different the next day. So how we respond to our own emotions, understanding that we are agitated by this situation. And, my favorite books is The Fox, the Mole, and the Horse. And in that as well, the greatest freedom lies in how we react. So the triggers that come in our life. So sorry, I think we might be deviating a little bit, but this is, how we are all humans, we are emotional beings. And the more we learn, the more we know about ourselves, and going back to that self-awareness journey, that I'm aware that I get triggered by this. I'm aware that this is how I respond to certain situations. So how, through listening, through understanding and feeling my own emotions, how can I pause to reflect and respond using CQ?
I love that comment from the audience about research showing that in US culture, most people can only tolerate about 7 seconds of silence. And as a facilitator, this is something that I have had to get used to, honestly, because sometimes for the learning process to occur, we need to allow some silence. For some people to process, we need to allow some silence, or we just need to pose a question, and perhaps depending on one's level of anxiety about that silence, they will say anything just to break that silence. In other cultures, that is the complete opposite. People expect to have that time to process what you are saying or the question you're posing. And the respectful, again, thing to do is to wait, is to truly reflect before responding. So not only being aware of those differences, but knowing how to navigate them. Becoming more comfortable with a behavior that would naturally be uncomfortable for you. This is the power of CQ action. You flex your behavior to adjust and then to become more effective. I want to acknowledge another comment from the audience about Darth Vader and having zero EQ, maybe zero self-awareness, but being able to manipulate the emotions of others, right? And Keela challenged us also to talk about how to combat it. So I would bring us to another CQ capability. So the metacognitive dimension of CQ, which is CQ strategy. So remember, we talked about the motivation, we talked about the knowledge, so that understanding of these cultural differences and similarities. But then CQ strategy is about planning for those interactions where you will encounter diversity of values, diversity of preferences. And one very important part of CQ strategy, beyond the awareness, is what we call checking. That's one of the sub-dimensions of CQ strategy. So when you are in that environment, do you check with people? Do you ask for feedback? Do you then reflect on whether your previous assumptions about emotion and the reactions in that culture were accurate or not?
Viviana, thanks for bringing that up. That reminds me of a question that I often ask myself, is that when I get triggered in these times and I get emotional and get angry or frustrated by something, to ask myself the question, what about the situation is making me feel this way? And it ties beautifully back into EQ and understanding my own emotions to this. And as I've been practicing this over the last couple of maybe 3-4 years, I've started to realize that I learned so much more about myself by just asking that simple question in that moment. What is triggering me? Why am I feeling insecure? Why am I feeling angry? What about this is, and that has opened me up to so much more learning than being reactive in these situations. So thanks for reminding us about the power of CQ strategy.
Yeah, thank you for that, Viviani. And I think that you're answering many of the audience's questions about, well, if this pause is important, how do we do that in a way that's culturally intelligent? And I think that you touched on that. And I've seen other of the audience members, somebody said, I'm also a facilitator and I explain the reason for the pause, before the pause, so that it's not misunderstood. So what a great example. Let's keep moving on so we have space for our audience to ask us some questions. One more question here for my panelists from our end. Is there anything about today that makes the application of cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence even more critical? For example, our digital world. Quentin, can we go ahead and start with you on this one?
Yeah, and for me, this is such a interesting space because when I facilitate in person, I'm very in tune with what's happening in the room. I notice people's fingers moving, I notice a twitch, and then you're able to go after or engage with those kind of things. And what I find when I'm facilitating online, it is really, really difficult to pick up on people's emotions, pick up on whether people are following you. And I must be honest, over the last 2 years of facilitating online, there have been times that I've been wondering if I've just been speaking to myself on the screen because I lack that sort of engagement that we have. And even the protocols that we have online now, so people muting themselves. So I can't hear Viviana going, or oh no, and so I find it so difficult to pick up on those things. Yes, and then sometimes Zoom and these things have allowed us to put little icons up, like a little celebration or a heart or something. And I found that to be really helpful at times to know that people are engaging with me. And the more kinds of emojis that come up, that have been a little bit helpful to me. But it's been a massive struggle for me. And the question that I put to us as a group before we went online was to say, I'm wondering whether neutral cultures have been able to function online more effectively than expressive cultures, because expressive cultures, we rely on those cultural cues that we're getting versus neutral cultures that are quite okay with just a neutral sort of engagement and will push on. And so I'm wondering whether my colleagues on the call have had any experience around this.
Can I pitch in with another saying from Lynn Van Dyne recently that has left a deep impact on me and is also open for debate, let's say. But what Lynn said recently is that the responsibility for any relationship to work sits with the person who has the highest EQ. And the reason I say that's up for debate is how does that affect people of culture, people of color, for example. So let's put that to the side, but let's just assume that, yes, the responsibility sits with the person with the highest EQ. So if you're on that call, running the session or part of the audience, how do you read the room, the virtual room? What ground rules are you laying? How much space are you creating for those in the room with respect, whether they want to be on video or not? How are you engaging? What questions are you asking? How are you, how are you making sure that you're getting the response from each and everyone in that virtual room in the way that it works for them? So I think that, again, works both ways in how EQ and CQ can translate in the virtual world as much as it does in the real world when we are on stage and being able to read those emotions much more easily.
Thanks, Ritika. Viviani, before
Yes.
you respond, I'd like to ask you, please, there was a question in the audience. The term neutral is not familiar to everyone. Can you describe that before you answer, please?
Of course. So Quentin was talking about the level of expressiveness that is typical in a culture. So a neutral culture, and Quentin, correct me if I am not conveying what you were trying to say here. A neutral culture is a culture in which people don't expect others to display, or you usually don't display emotions in an open way. You are more stoic, you are more neutral in your facial expressions. Perhaps you don't vary the volume of your voice, as opposed to cultures that are more expressive or affective. And in those cultures, it is more common to vary your vocal inflections and your facial expressions. And so you can pick up the emotional cues according to those changes in facial expressions, in voice, in body language also. So in the virtual environment, for sure, that is a challenge and it is a struggle. As a facilitator like Quentin, it is much more difficult to read the room when you are facilitating virtually. And what we try to do, for instance, in our sessions is to provide different opportunities, different channels for people to contribute to the discussion. Not everyone will feel comfortable raising their hand, even on Zoom, and spontaneously offering their opinion. Some people will prefer, when assigned to a group discussion, we do breakout rooms on Zoom, and then as a group or within a smaller group, they will feel more comfortable offering their opinion, telling their stories, but not in such a public setting in front of, say, a virtual room of 30 to 50 people. So that would be one of the examples.
Yeah, I think that's great, Viviani. And I think that that's what we've done to take the best practices from an in-person setting into a virtual world. Like Viviani said, it's offering different modes of communication, right? Different ways to engage. Some people may not want to speak up against the group. For some people, it's quite uncomfortable to play the devil's advocate. So perhaps chat functionality where they can say that and not need to say it aloud offers a bit of safety. Also, the idea of utilizing polls, right? Some people don't feel comfortable saying their own statements, but they would feel comfortable reacting to a question. So those are a few examples that you can use in an online setting to offer different modes of communication for your audience types. Is there anything else that our panelists would like to add to this final question before we go ahead and get into some of the audience questions? We've had some very rich ones I'd like us to get into. Anything from our three panelists on today's digital world? Great.
I'm keen on the questions from the audience.
Yes. So let's start. The first question I put to the panelist is, does one need to be familiar with a specific culture to be emotionally intelligent within it? Or are there things to look for that can be spread across multiple cultures? Quentin, let's go ahead and start with you. Does one need to be familiar with a culture to be emotionally intelligent within it?
I think so. I think you need to understand at least a baseline around some kind of aspects around that. So in preparation for this, not all facial expressions are the same around the world. And so if I'm expressing anger, somebody else might interpret it as something else. Or if I think there's some South Pacific islands where there's no facial expression for excitement. It's a sound. And so if you're aware of that, you can be far more effective. And so I think it is requiring some kind of base understanding and doing, like I saw there, doing some kind of homework before you launch off and make a whole bunch of assumptions into that. Yeah, so I think yeah.
Great answer, Quentin. Thank you. Viviani, do you want to add to that?
Sure, and I completely agree with Quentin. I think that the self-awareness and self-management portions of emotional intelligence are okay. You don't need to be aware of other cultures to understand your own emotions and how to manage them. But the part about how to express them and how to interpret the emotions of the people you're interacting with, yes, you need at least some knowledge of that culture and how those symbols and how those expressions play into that cultural group. Of course, we cannot be aware of how every culture in the world will express emotions and interpret your emotions. We couldn't, that would be impossible. So first of all, the CQ framework has something very important. So I mentioned the CQ drive, so that motivation. I also mentioned CQ strategy. So not only the planning, but the awareness that you can maintain during each encounter to try to understand what is going on and how your behavior is being perceived. And then the check-in can be something very straightforward, really talking to people to understand how they perceive that. Now, and someone in the audience just said that the cultures you need to interact with the most frequently, yes, we would advise to truly invest in the knowledge of those differences and similarities in cultural values, in preferences, in the level of expressiveness to then be more effective in interacting with those.
Great. Thanks, Viviani. I want to move to another really interesting question here that was posed by the audience. And Ritika, I'm going to ask you to answer this one because you're the one who was talking about the person with the higher EQ and CQ needing to be the one that flexes, okay? So here's the question. If the responsibility lies with the person who has the higher emotional or cultural intelligence, what does that mean if it puts, or could it put, an inequitable burden on the BIPOC community? Do you want to start with this one, Ritika?
No.
That's a tough one. I'm giving it right to you.
No, well, this is the thing. I think, Dave Livermore was here a couple of weeks ago, and we discussed exactly this question in a lot of detail around how even me as a woman of color, presumably now that I'm working for the Cultural Intelligence Center, have relatively high CQ. How does that work? It's a very difficult one because, having sort of gone through the journey, which is very different as a woman of color than it would have been in any other intersectionality, it's a difficult one to answer, and I really don't know how to.
Mm.
I don't know if Viviani and Quentin have a say in that. I research and how that works out in those with higher CQ responding to situations where the burden comes on the person of color. How does that work?
I would put a different swing on it, and I'd say the person with the privilege needs to, or with the power, rather than with the knowledge or with that. So it is. How do I put it? It's the people, the one with the power and the privilege, responsibility to break down the system that gives them the privilege in those kind of spaces. So, and when we're in those different spaces, that power and privilege shifts depending on your different contexts. But if you walk into the room, and most of the rooms that I walk into those rooms with the power and the privilege, and I need to be aware of that. And so how do I, as the person that is benefiting from that system, break down that system that everyone feels that they have parity or equality in that space, then to have a voice, then to express themselves. I think that would be my initial response to that.
I love that, Quentin. And, I always do say that all of us have privilege, as, that's another debate, right? But
Yeah.
all of us have some privilege or the other. There's a lot of people around the world that are now saying to me that you're in a position of privilege to speak on behalf of women of color. I never looked at it like that till about a year ago, but I am in a position of privilege. And so how do I use my EQ, CQ in that position of privilege to show up as a flexible, respectable, respected, empathetic leader? So, I love that. Thank you, Quentin.
Yeah. Sorry.
Great
Viviana?
answers. Great answers. And thank you, Ritika, for showing your vulnerability, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay that we can't answer some of the really, really tough questions, but that's why we're all here, because there are tough questions that need to be.
And we didn't prep for this, Keela, just to put it out in the audience. So there we go.
We didn't prepare for this one. Before we keep going on that one, let's ask another question from the audience. In a diverse group or team, how do you create safety and belonging for everyone if there are several different ways of showing up or participating? It seems like we often default to the dominant culture. Viviani, can you please answer this one for us?
I will try. And this is what we talk about effective leaders. This is what we talk when we say emotionally and culturally intelligent leaders. So again, let's talk about the drive. Do you have the motivation to promote inclusion and belonging to all members, for all members of your team? And then, did you take the time to know their preferences in terms of their work style, their approach to time, their preferred communication style? And with that, you can start planning to accommodate those different preferences. So I think that is the first step. And if I could take us back a little bit to Quentin's response to the previous question. And for those of us who have the privilege to be exposed to cultural intelligence, who have the opportunity to develop our emotional intelligence, I think we have a great deal of responsibility for applying these. If we have the conditions, if we have exposure and all the conditions that favor our development of those abilities, then we have the responsibility to act. And safety and psychological safety is not a unique model. There's not a unique format for them. It can also look like different things for different groups. The main idea is that people feel safe taking interpersonal risks. So what does that mean? So a leader that conducts every meeting in a uniform manner and is not getting contribution from all team members. Not everyone is speaking. The same person is leading every single meeting and the results are uniformly negative.
Yeah.
Do you then start rotating who leads the meeting? Do you give people a chance to express what they understood at the end of the meeting? And again, as Keila mentioned, the several modes of communication to collect that. I think those are simple measures on the way to building that safety.
Something that comes to mind is the use of language. And so people often say to me, I can't get angry in Afrikaans, so I can't express my emotions in English. I have to use Xhosa to speak and express. And so what we've done in some of our teams is allow people to, because sometimes just to express yourself is the first step in the communication around this. And so we've allowed team members to speak in their indigenous languages first, to express their anger, to express their joy. And then we'll work backwards to say, okay, so what did that mean? Or use that as an opportunity to learn. So I found that to be really helpful as a tool to help people express themselves.
I absolutely love the responses from both Viviani and Quentin on this one, and sort of reflecting back to that question and tying it all together around the power, the privilege. How do we respond? And just, putting myself again as a woman of color in that space, how did I respond differently to situations before I went on the CQ journey? Even nothing about me has changed. My color is the same, my gender is the same. But because I think I have more CQ now than I did a year ago, purely because also of the nature of the work I do, it's how do I respond to the triggers, or how do I'm so self-aware of what is triggering me and how I respond to that. That itself means, how do I show up as a leader and create the psychologically safe space, not just for myself, but for those around me?
Correct.
Great answers. I want to ask one more as we wrap up our discussion today. And this is playing off of what we're talking about right now. Multiple people have asked, one would need to be in a position of power, as we're all saying, leaders in the room, right? How do we create the right environment? So it says one would have to be in a position of power to utilize their CQ or EQ in the way that we're describing. How do we do this if we're in a different chair, if we're not in the position of power? And I'd like to actually start by answering this one from my own personal experience. I started working for the CQ Center just out of university when I graduated. I was not in a position of power whatsoever. I was a part-time administrative assistant, and I was learning a lot about this framework that was new to me. And the way I would answer this is it really comes back to that CQ drive, that motivation, right? Are we as individuals, this is a very personal thing. It doesn't need to be pushed from the top down from our leaders. As I was learning about cultural intelligence and really reflecting on my motivations, why is it that I want to engage with people who aren't like me? Some of those were extrinsic. I want to further my career. Some of those were very intrinsic. So I would say if you're sitting in a chair where you're not in a position of power, there's plenty of reasons to develop your cultural intelligence to influence from exactly where you sit. regardless of where that is. And I've got my own personal experiences of doing that for many, many years. And I think that's the beautiful thing about CQ is it's unique and personal to all of us. And if we so choose, we can develop and enhance our capabilities in this space. So it doesn't matter which chair we sit in, but it's up to all of us who know about this, as Viviani said, to continue the mission of exploring and sharing and building connections in this way. Is there anybody else who'd like to answer this in the last minute that we have to wrap up?
So something came to mind immediately when I heard that question, and it's a story of Nelson Mandela when he was on Robben Island and having been in jail, and always saying that he needed to understand, inverted commas, his enemy. So he learned Afrikaans. He was very generous to the guards that he was with. He would grow vegetables for them, and he started to understand their culture and where they were coming from. So from the prison cell all the way up to the presidency, he showed this curiosity, he showed this generosity. And so I think even when you don't have physical power, you can have social power, and you can start building those relationships, and that curiosity then sets you up to have real conversations. So that's something that came to mind immediately as I heard that question.
Thank you, Quentin. We are at time, so I'm going to close us off by thanking everyone for joining us today from wherever you are around the world. Not only will we share this recording, we've had a request to share the chat as well because it's been so rich. We will do that. And we will also send out resources as we've discussed. So thanks to everybody for joining today, and have a great rest of your afternoon, evening, or morning.